My name is Richard Dean Winfield. I've been living in Athens since 1982, teaching at the university, teaching philosophy, writing philosophy.
Can you be a little louder?
Okay, I've been living in Athens since 1982, teaching philosophy at the university. And I am planning to run for Congress in the 10th district. But I'm not allowed by law to officially announce until I go on unpaid leave. And I have applied for unpaid leave. I've been granted unpaid leave starting in January. Now that situation, by the way, reflects a problem pertaining to the right to run for public office that I think is worth dwelling upon for a moment. Because I think we ordinarily presume that we all have the right to run for public office. Theoretically, we do if we meet the residency and age requirements. But in reality, if you are an employee, you have 3 strikes against you if you're trying to run for office. First of all, if you're going to be waging a meaningful campaign, you have to take off from work.
Right.
Which means first you have no income. Secondly, in a country like ours, you lose all the benefits that are associated with your job. And thirdly, in many cases, you can't expect to get your job back after the campaign. Now, in my case, I am prohibited from running until I go on unpaid leave, lose my salary, lose my benefits. But I have the chance of getting my job back because I will be on leave for a year.
Because of what?
Because I will be on leave, which means I can get it back. That's the one saving grace that I have.
Right.
Yeah.
Now the reason that I am entertaining this idea of leaving the ivory tower behind is that I really feel that no one in government, and really no one in the major political parties, are putting forward the bold policies that I think we need to advocate in order to save the American dream from being on life support and save our democracy from further weakening and perhaps ultimate destruction. Now, I think to understand the magnitude of the problem, I think we have to think about our Constitution. Because I think if we reflect on our Constitution, we can say that there's something incomplete about it. We know that our Constitution focuses upon laying out our political rights, the structure of the government, of representative democracy we have, and what role we can play in it. It lays out our legal rights as legal subjects, but it has virtually nothing to say about our rights and duties as family members or as members of society. Now, as we all know, to begin with, our founders could be said to have misinterpreted and misapplied the strictures of our Constitution, in that the political and legal rights that it advocates were interpreted and enforced as if they were privileges. Because the only individuals who from the beginning could count on being able to exercise all their political rights and legal rights were men who were white and had a certain amount of property. Now, there have been several centuries of civil rights struggles to have our Constitution be consistently applied, so that instead of having our rights treated as privileges, they would apply to all adult citizens. But I think the very triumphs of the civil rights movement have shown that our legal and political rights are not enough to enable us to participate as equals in democracy. And a core reason is that in order to participate in democracy, we have to be able to take care of our families and be able to earn a living on a par with others, and not be subject to relations of inequality and domination in either the household or in society. I think this difficulty has been apparent to many, and I just want to point to 2 very salient moments in American history where one sees this difficulty being laid out in a very clear way. One was after the Civil War, when in all the southern states, the newly emancipated slaves demanded not just that they be given equal rights as legal subjects and equal rights as citizens, so that they could vote, run for office, sit on juries, be equal before the law. They also demanded 2 other things in every southern state. They demanded land and public education. Because they realized the Constitution, as well as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were in the course of being adopted, that none of these constitutional monuments were sufficient to really enable them to be free. They needed to have a means of being able to support themselves. And for that, they needed an economic basis to have a livelihood, and they needed the education, without which they couldn't function as equals. Now we can leap ahead another 80 years. In 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made his last State of the Union address. And he pointed out that in America, it's becoming more and more obvious that our Constitution is not sufficient to enable us to exercise our freedoms. We need, he said, a new Bill of Rights that would enable us to be sure that we all have a livelihood, that we all have access to education, that we all have decent housing, that we all have access to culture. And we need to go beyond what is given in the Constitution. Now, he died not long after that. He didn't have time to implement this call for a new Bill of Rights. His wife, Eleanor, tried to do that on an international level. You know, she was in charge of the committee at the United Nations in 1948 that drew up the International Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that did contain all of the rights that her husband had been advocating. And at the meeting of the General Assembly in 1948, all of the attending nations, with the exception of the Soviet Union and its satellites, South Africa and Saudi Arabia, voted in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But I think it's clear to us that we as a nation have not enforced the rights that are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So today, where are we? Well, we are the most unequal developed nation in the world, with the greatest inequality of wealth. We're the top 1%, as we all know, have as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Where 25% of all Americans have zero or negative net worth. Where 75% of all Americans have no more than $700, keeping them away from insolvency. Where almost half our children are growing up in poverty. Where social mobility is less in our nation than in any developed nation in the world. Where, in other words, you know, if any of us were to tell our children that they can expect to either do as well or better than their parents, they are dreaming. So I think we're in a position where we need to deal with this unfinished business. And I want to put before you the outline of what I want to call a new social Bill of Rights that will involve bold proposals for providing the bases for allowing us to really exercise our freedoms. And the anchor of this new social Bill of Rights is the true right to work. It's the right of all adults who are willing and able to have a job sufficient to support themselves and their dependents. This is the basis of economic independence and security. Now, I think to understand why it is so, one has to think about the options that we have to earn a living in a market society. And we need markets because without markets, we can't exercise our freedom to choose what we want to have as our needs and what kind of activity we want to engage in to satisfy our needs. The market, offers us not only the opportunity to seek to earn a livelihood by getting a job. We could, of course, also attempt to be entrepreneurs. We could also attempt to live off rent. Everyone in a genuine civil society where we are all recognized to be owners of ourselves, where no one is treated as a slave, we all, in that sense, have the opportunity to attempt to offer our capacity to work to someone else. Some of us have the additional endowment of enough money or enough access to credit to attempt to earn a living as an entrepreneur. Some of us equally have enough additional capital or access to credit to obtain property that one can rent out and earn a living as a landlord. And admittedly, in these two types of enterprise, as an entrepreneur attempting to live off a business, as a landlord attempting to live off rentable property, there is a risk, right? There's no guarantee that you will succeed. But if you fail as an entrepreneur or a landlord, you're back in the position of everyone else, where you have to rely upon your labor power to earn a living. So that's one of the reasons why guaranteeing to everyone who wants a job is the real foundation of economic independence and security. You know, it's a fantasy to think that everyone can earn a living as an entrepreneur. And you can see this if you think about the way the market operates. You know, competition requires firms to grow in order to survive. They have to obtain as much capital as they can in order to become more and more competitive, to become more efficient in what they're producing and marketing, to come up with new products and so forth. So it's no accident that a market economy comes to be dominated by larger and larger and more concentrated firms. And these will take a form of ownership which is able to obtain as much capital as possible. And the form of enterprise that has that character is none other than the public share issuing corporation, which has inevitably become the dominant force in an economy. So we have to keep that in mind. It's no accident that 85% of Americans who are actually engaged in earning a living are employees, and that of the 27 million so-called small businesses, which are defined by the government as having 500 or fewer employees, 90%, or 24 million, actually employ no one. These so-called small businesses are actually freelancers, members of the gig economy, namely people who are offering for sale some service or product. They are, in effect, piece workers. So if you think about these aspects that are, in some respect, bound up with the dynamic of the market, we can see that a key to being able to exercise one's economic independence and be able to take care of oneself as well as one's dependents is the certainty of being able to have a job if one wants one. Now, the market cannot guarantee that everyone is going to have a job. Competition has winners and losers. The losers are going to have to cut back on their employment. The winners also are going to be changing the way they produce, the way they market, what goods and services they have to offer. So they will have turmoil in their own labor force. So if we really are to ensure that everyone has economic independence and security, our government has to live up to its promise to be for the people and guarantee that it will ensure that everyone has a job who wants a job when the market fails to do so. And this does not involve duplicating what private enterprise is already doing, because that would just exacerbate unemployment. Instead, it has to involve government stepping in and providing the kinds of goods and services that profit-seeking enterprises are not able or willing to provide. And this is not make work. There are huge things that we need that serve the public good. We know, of course, that our infrastructure is ailing and needs to be repaired. We know we need a new infrastructure that is green, that is based on renewable energy, because if we're going to be able to exercise any of our rights, we have to have an environment that is livable. We know that we need, in order to be able to function as equals, access to broadband. We need to have broadband for everyone. We need to provide transportation to everyone out in the small towns and rural districts of the 10th district and other similar neighborhoods. Because how can people who either don't have cars or are no longer able to drive, how can they get to work, see their friends and family, get medical aid, and so forth and so on? We need to refurbish all the substandard housing. We need to provide all sorts of services that people need but are not able to get. And then we can use a flowering of all of the arts and make available to a much wider audience music, drama, film, and all the other things that not everyone today has access to. Now you might ask, is this possible? Well, I think you all know it was done on a massive scale, starting in 1935 during the Great Depression. And it was done when the United States had 127 million people. Now we have 325 plus million people. It was done when our economy was much, much poorer. Our economy at that time in 1935 had 6% of the wealth it has now. And we were in the greatest economic calamity our nation has ever been in. Nonetheless, with the WPA, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Arts Project, 8.5 million people were put to work. And as we know, they produced some of the greatest public works from which we've benefited since. So it's possible to go ahead and do this. And I think if you reflect upon it, I think you can see how transformative it would be. I mean, think of the situation of young people who today, when they come of age to work, face twice the unemployment rate of anyone else. And if they're in a minority community, they face double that. Well, imagine their situation if they know that when they're old enough to work, they have a job awaiting them, which they can support themselves on and which will serve the common good. Think of how transformative it would be if everyone coming out of prison knew that they have a job awaiting them that serves the community, that allows them to have a decent livelihood. Obviously, that will have a tremendous impact on crime and on our social fabric as a whole. Think about the situation that people coming back from war will be in, where instead of facing the prospect of unemployment and homelessness, one of the big disgraces of our society is the spectacle of homeless veterans begging in our streets. Well, think of how things would be different if everyone coming back from war knew they had a job awaiting them. And think of the situation of those of us who are lucky enough to have work. We don't have to worry about being downsized or put into a part-time position, because there would be a full-time job serving the public good. This guarantee of employment to all who want to work will really be the basis of a new flowering of freedom. But it's not enough. We have to think about what should be the new minimum fair wage that people should receive. And I think it's not enough to talk about a living wage. I think we need to talk about a fair wage. Now note, by the way, that the position of guaranteed employment is not something that any government official is advocating. It's not something that any candidate in the Democratic Party has been advocating. Bernie Sanders did not advocate it. Our revolution does not advocate it. Indivisible, as far as I know, does not advocate it. But it is a fundamental demand that we have to think about. And I might add that the only people in recent history who did advocate it were Martin Luther King at the very end of his life, when he was marching with the sanitation workers in Memphis, and Loretta Scott King, who in 1974 set up an organization for full employment, which had some big demonstrations. It tried to pass the Humphrey Hawkins bill, which was supposed to be about full employment, but it got watered down, and so we haven't had that guarantee. But that guarantee by itself is not enough. We have to think about what is a fair wage. Now, by a fair wage, I'm talking about a wage that not only allows individuals to get by and is adjusted for inflation, but a wage that is also adjusted for productivity gains. And the reason why that is crucial is that it is a principle that ensures that we as a society all benefit from whatever growing prosperity we have. From 1945 to 1973, wages in the United States rose in tandem with the rise in productivity. That is, as the national wealth increased, wages increased accordingly. And as a result, broad parts of American society had a rising standard of living. In 1973, that stopped. And one can think about why it stopped. There were certain political changes that took place, and a failure really on the part of both political parties to keep their eye on this connection between wage levels and productivity gains. Because starting in 1973, wages stagnated in real terms. Productivity continued to increase. But what does it mean when wage levels stagnate and productivity increases? It means that we become as a nation more and more unequal. Wages have become a smaller and smaller fraction of the national wealth. So that now we have become more unequal as a society in the distribution of wealth than we've ever been since the Gilded Age. And significantly, our national wealth, our national economy has been growing at a rate that is half of what it had been when wages kept pace with productivity. And I think one has to think about why that's the case. It really gives the lie to the trickle-down theory. Because when you have more and more inequality in the distribution of wealth, those who are at the top end are sitting on huge reserves of wealth that they simply can't spend. Whereas if we have a wider, more even distribution of wealth, much more of that wealth is going to be spent. Because those who are not in the top 1% are going to be spending more and more of their income, and that is going to produce an effect where there'll be growing and growing economic activity. So we're facing both growing inequality and a certain degree of stagnation. And we can reverse that if we think seriously about militating not for a living wage adjusted for inflation, but a fair wage, a wage that keeps pace with the growth of the economy. So we all rise as the level of wealth increases. And if you want to ask what that would be, well, these are some figures to keep in mind. In 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. If you adjust that for inflation, it comes to $10.50. If you adjust it for productivity gains, it comes to $22 an hour. I'm going to suggest that we think about a fair minimum wage as $20 an hour, and that it be adjusted both for inflation and productivity gains. That's equivalent to $41,600 per year. Can it be done? Well, I think if you look at the figures, it's obvious that it can be done. Because our national income is about $18 trillion. There are only about 160 million people who actually earn a living in the United States. So if you do the math, it turns out the average income is $112,000 a year. Now, I think we all know that there are very, very few Americans who make six figures. Actually, only 7% of wage earners make $100,000 or more. There's tremendous inequality in income. There's plenty of room to raise the floor to $41,600. And I think you can understand that that would strike a great blow against poverty wages. Now, having guaranteed jobs, having a new minimum fair wage, which would also involve giving to those who can't work because of disability or because they no longer are able to work, the same amount. I mean, disability payment should be no less than a fair minimum wage. Retirement should be no less than a fair minimum wage, not what Social Security gives us currently. But then there's still the issue of the dignity of work and the degree to which we as employees have any fair say in our workplace. And that obviously is connected to what degree we are in a position to have improving work conditions and improving wages. And I think we have to recognize there is an inherent disparity in the economic power and opportunity of employees versus employers, especially as employers become bigger and more concentrated. Globalization allows multinational corporations to move their productions anywhere in the world. The gig economy is allowing employers now to get rid of full-time workers and find people to do things through the internet anytime, for any amount of hours, wherever they want. All these positions put us in a very weak position as employees. So I think we have to deal with this in two respects. On the one hand, we need to think about restructuring corporate board of directors, which currently involve no participation on the part of employees. And the board of directors and the CEOs are in collusion. They have their hands in the till. CEOs now make over 300 times what the average employee makes. They're more concerned with their stock portfolios than the viability of their enterprise. Well, that can be changed if we do something that has been done in many European countries. Namely, we mandate that half the members of boards of directors must be drawn from non-managerial employees who will be able to elect their representatives. On the other hand, we have to ensure that employees can join together to negotiate the conditions of their employment. Right now, only 6% of employees in the private sector are unionized. And the decline in unionization almost perfectly matches the stagnation of wages. So I'm suggesting that we have to have mandatory collective bargaining, where any enterprise that employs multiple employees, be they part-time, full-time, gig economy people, that they must be required to engage in collective bargaining with the elected representatives of their employees. Well, these measures of employee empowerment, together with guaranteed employment, together with a fair wage, provide the beginnings of a situation where economic independence and security will become a fact of life. But it's still not enough, because no one is going to be able to take advantage of these opportunities if they have to choose between taking care of their family and earning a livelihood. And we all know the challenges that there are in ensuring that we can do both. And to be able to do both, we have to look at two sides of the problem. On the one hand, we have to ensure that in our workplaces, we all have the opportunity to take care of our families, meaning we should all have at least a 1-month paid vacation, as is the case in most developed nations in the world. We ought to have at least a 9-month paid parental leave policy, which also many countries in the world have, so that we can take care of our newborns. On the other hand, these measures are not enough, because many, many American families cannot pay for child care. And they also can't pay for elder care. Because as we all know, with more and more of the population living longer and longer, many families have to deal with the fact that their oldest members may have 1 or 2 years or more where they require 24-hour care, and it's unaffordable. So I think we have to deal with these issues and have free public daycare and free public elder care. And in addition, if we really want to eliminate childhood poverty, we have to recognize that a fair minimum wage is not enough, because how much money you need to deal with your family depends upon how many family members you have. So we need to have a child allowance of at least $500 per child per month. That, with public daycare, public elder care, would allow us to take care of our families and have a viable existence. Now, obviously, we can't do any of this if we're not healthy, so we need to all be able to have our health taken care of as a matter of right, because we can't exercise any freedom without it.
Mm-hmm.
But Medicare for all is not sufficient. And I think all of you know something I've been discovering, which is that Medicare is not sufficient,
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't cover everything.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to pay for many of the services. What we need instead, if everyone is really going to have access to health care, is a super Medicare, where there are no copays, no deductibles, where all physical, mental, and dental care is taken care of. Now we have to deal also with the same thing with regard to housing and ensure that everyone has affordable housing. We need to provide some kind of insurance so that no one is evicted or foreclosed because they don't have the money to pay for rent or mortgage. We have to have some backup plan where there's an automatic rescheduling of payments. And where, on the other hand, landlords or banks do not themselves have to become insolvent because people can't pay. So we can have a publicly funded system to deal with this. And you might ask, well, where is all of the money going to come from? I think the fair way of paying for all of these programs that will realize a new social bill of rights is to draw upon something that has not been drawn upon in our public tax policy, and that is wealth. Now, the wealth that is in private hands in the United States is the greatest accumulation of wealth in human history. It's about 6 times our national income. It's over $90 trillion. And as I mentioned earlier, it's extremely unevenly distributed, much more unevenly distributed than income. And all of that wealth in the hands of the 1% is to a large extent sitting there unused. So we can pay for all of these programs I'm speaking about by turning to a highly graduated wealth tax. And that will itself help promote our economic vitality by putting money in the hands of those who are more likely to spend it. Now I want to add one final part to a program for a new social bill of rights. and that is